Good morning, everyone, and welcome to St. Luke's Sunday Forum. We have resumed after our lockdown and exiting our church. And now we are doing everything via Zoom and other technical delivery systems. And today, Sunday, May 3, is the third in a series of conversations with people who can enlighten us about the care of creation. My colleagues, Sharon Young and Sue Sherrill, have put this together, thank God for me, and they have envisioned it, I love it, creation celebration, tending God's garden. And we have today an amazing resource with us, Dr. Mark Douglas, who is an ethics professor at Columbia Theological Seminary here in Atlanta. And we're very grateful for your being with us, Mark. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
You're welcome. Glad to be with you all virtually.
Yes, indeed. Mark, everybody's going to be very curious about the fact that you are on a Pacific island. Could you just kind of enlighten us about that, please?
Sure. When the pandemic hit and the seminary, the campus closed and all classes moved online, I built an office in my basement, which is unfinished and has various, insulation and bare walls. And I thought, rather than make people look at my basement, I would give them a nice background. And 4 months ago, I was leading a trip in the Bahamas, teaching on creation care as part of a sea kayaking trip that I was co-leading. And so this background reminds me of the Bahamas and an innocent time 4 months ago. And it gives people something much nicer to look at than my really ugly basement.
Very good. Well, we appreciate all aesthetic concerns. Thank you very much. And I'm in my holy study library in Birmingham, Alabama, where I study, preach, write, pray, and I'm really thrilled to be here. So let's get into it. We're really, really, really glad you're here. I would love it if you wouldn't mind, and we need to just note that you have been formed in part at University of Virginia and Princeton, and your undergraduate school is
Colorado College, where I was a biology major.
Yeah, I was very interested that you were pre-med. So I always love and am attracted to talking with people who are both scientists and theologians. So it's nice to have your brain to tap about this morning. So my threshold question is, can you tell us the story about how you became passionate about the environment and environmentalism, ecosystem, ecology as an ethical matter and actually an ethical imperative?
Sure. So it helps to know that I grew up on a farm in Colorado. Along the Front Range, my parents built our house to face away from the road and look directly at Pikes Peak through our picture windows. So I grew up surrounded by nature. My dad is a mechanical engineer, HVAC, and when we built the house in the late 70s, the Carter administration at that time had decided to subsidize solar energy. And while building the house, my dad said, if I do the labor, we can make this solar thing work for us. So I actually grew up in a house that was heated by solar panels, and in the country, just surrounded by really beautiful, beautiful views, just looking out at, for instance, Pikes, or at Longs Peak, rather, outside of Fort Collins. And really running away to the mountains 4 seasons of the year every chance I could. I just liked being outside. That shaped for me kind of a love of the natural world. And that love stayed in place throughout my life. And increasingly, as I matured, especially kind of in college as a biology major and taking courses, doing fieldwork courses, recognizing not only the resilience and the wonders of the natural world, but the fragility of it. And increasingly, as I grew into the faith, seeing the need to connect the way my own faith development had to, not could, but had to be tied to concern for creation.
Yeah.
So as I continued along the way, I helped start a new environmental group at Princeton Seminary when I was there. I did a couple of courses on environmental ethics while I was doing my PhD at the University of Virginia, and then got to Columbia Seminary and helped start Earth Covenant Ministries for the Presbyterian Church in this area, and then eventually became a part of Georgia Interfaith Power and Light, with which your congregation is well familiar, and eventually chaired their board for a time.
Excellent.
I will say that I never, until recently, have taught classes on environmental issues, even though I've been researching and writing on them. And part of that is just a sense, misguided as it turned out to be earlier in my time at Columbia, and I've been here for a couple of decades now, that those courses did not carry the levels of interest necessary, and that would feel less immediately applicable to the ministries that our graduates would be going into. I have definitely changed my mind on that, and now I include attention to environmental ethics in a lot of the courses that I teach, and teach courses specifically on environmental ethics. We are in the middle of the most rapid increase in greenhouse gases in recorded history, at least human beings have been around, I should say, in the middle of the sixth great extinction, as Elizabeth Kolbert has described it, in the middle of an exponential growth in pollutants around the world. There is no way at this point to ignore the degree to which our interactions with the non-human natural world are impacting it at geological and fundamental levels, and it is impacting us at those same levels. So there's the unavoidability of dealing with the non-human natural world is pronounced, and this current pandemic helps reveal that. Right, we are in the middle of this pandemic, revealing sicknesses, if you will, in the non-human natural world and in our own, the human constructed world, that need attention.
So thank you very much for that, because you've really laid out the roadmap for the conversation I want to have. You unpacked a lot right there, and so I really want to return to actually each one of those points as a way of illuminating both the moral, I'm going to say again, moral imperative of addressing creation care, and also how that might change from what we're learning in this COVID-19 crisis. But before we even get to that, I would love to back up again and ask a question. In your narrative, in your story, in your journey, when did it begin to occur to you that all of creation is interwoven, and it is interwoven with us, and that how we treat creation really has an impact on how creation treats us? You know what I'm getting at there?
Yeah, I do. So I would say that started to happen really in more developed ways, explicitly, thoughtful ways, cognitive ways, while I was in college. Some of that was the readings I was doing as a biology major. Some of that was readings I was doing on my own. I recall at one point reading an essay by a cosmologist named Thomas Berry. And in one of his essays, Berry says something to the effect of, I'm paraphrasing here, that if human beings had arisen on the moon, our senses of imagination would match the bleak landscape of the moon. We would think in few colors and with very kind of few, with a really reduced range of capacities for imaginative thought in order to shape our lives around us. But we didn't grow up on the come into existence in the moon. We came up into the existence of a verdant, multi-hued, complex, moving Earth. And that sentence, or those few sentences, really captured my attention to recognize that not only place, but the non-human natural world shaped how we think, how we dream, how we imagine, how we understand others and the world around us. So that was kind of an awakening for me, and I continued on reading in that vein. I came across kind of other cosmologists who felt way too fanciful for me when they were trying to draw interconnections between the human and the non-human natural world, between humanity and the rest of creation. But what has been the case was to recognize that what happens to us happens in part to the non-human natural world, that what we do shapes it. And fortunately, I had just a wealth of experiences to draw from, having grown up on a farm and seeing the impact of what weather did to our crops, what boll weevils did to our crops, what we did to our crops when we were spraying for Canada thistle or this or that or the other. So it wasn't so much that I discovered things that didn't exist, it's that I found linkages to things that I hadn't recognized needed to be linked.
Yeah. So before we move on from that and emphasize it, let me make a process observation about St. Luke's. And the people who are likely watching this right now, or who will watch it later, or who will share it, one of the commonalities is that we really love to learn. So when you drop a name like Thomas Berry,
Mm-hmm.
my job is, before we move on, to say, okay, Mark, where did that transformational sentence occur? In what of his books? Because I know that there are at least 10 people who are going to go and order a book today. They want to have that kind of transformational experience that Mark Douglas had.
Yeah, what a great question, and one that I absolutely cannot answer. It was in a collection of Berry essays. The
Okay.
book is on my shelf at school, and I am at home, and I couldn't actually get into my office right now because I'm not essential personnel there. Anyway, what I can do is send email, and I'll include that book once I have a chance to look it up, as well as some others that I may mention, and some others that I think are just really useful, good, oriented towards St. Luke's types of people.
Very good. You have just made me keep my job. I have gotten you to commit to sending us a reading list. Thank you very much. And it would be very difficult for you there on the beaches of Jamaica to find that book anyway. So you'll have to send it to us.
Well, as much as the economy has been struggling, I'm glad I can play a role in helping you keep your job.
Thank you very much. So I just simply want to underscore, while we have Thomas Berry in our minds, how crucial he has been for all of us. And just amazing the thinking and the poetry mm-hmm. that come from that person.
Yeah, and his influence, to see the way that he has influenced such a wide range of people through his sometimes really idiosyncratic thought, right? That whether it's theoretical physicists or environmental ethicists or a wide range of people, all of them kind of trace some of their thought back to Berry and some of his insights, especially about kind of a scientist worldview in a world that's bigger than the sciences.
Yeah. Okay, before we move even closer to the center of something you said earlier, I do need to ask the question, why does Christianity have such a horrible record of understanding the importance of caring for creation and the crisis in which we live?
So this is a great and huge question. It really finds great purchase in an essay by a author, a historian named Lynn White, who wrote an essay in the late 1960s. I'll send this one along as well,
Right?
in which he suggests he is exploring the religious origins of the current environmental crisis. He attributes the crisis largely to Christianity, and within Christianity to a couple of dominant frames of reference. The first is this notion of dominion, that human beings would have ownership over and control of the non-human natural world of creation. He also attributes it to a sense of the divine in Christianity, where he says God is separate from creation, and so the worship of God does not lead us into, but draws us out from creation. I will say that since that time, that essay, as hugely significant as it was, has been criticized on a variety of grounds, historical, religious, conceptual. I too have a number of criticisms of that essay. The chief one for me is that it only makes sense after the 16th century. That is,
Yeah.
for the first 15 centuries of Christianity's existence, we didn't think about dominion the way we do. We didn't have this radical separation of God and world that we do. And so to imagine that Christianity for 1600 years didn't really do anything that he says we're doing, then all of a sudden led to environmental calamity feels to me a little bit problematic. I would argue instead that really the origins of the current environmental crisis begin not with Christianity, but with modernity and the dawn of modernity, a Francis Baconian scientific worldview in which our purpose is to control and subdue nature. Now, that approach has proved hugely influential, way more influential, I think, in shaping modern sensibilities than we often recognize. This does not, by the way, get us out, get Christians out entirely cleanly from the situation, from playing a role in shaping the environmental crises that we face. It does not get us out of that for one reason. Francis Bacon was being shaped by a Christian worldview as that worldview was transitioning, and part of the way Christianity was transitioning had much less to do with getting science right than in exploring and conquering the new world, right? That Europeans were going to the New World for the purposes not only of discovery, but of gaining access to the resources there, because European resources were growing slim, and they were getting increasingly so because at that point, Europe especially, but the world was starting to enter what we have since come to refer to as the Little Ice Age, a period of increasing cold weather and reduced crop rates. And the hardships brought on by the onset of the Little Ice Age drove innovation that shaped science and technology and new ways of raising crops and all kinds of stuff. So Christianity was responding to those events and shaping those events, including in, say, the way Christian scholars were thinking about whether or not to wage war on these indigenous persons they were discovering. That's some of my own research right now. That gets a little bit tangential. But the upshot of this very long answer is that it doesn't start with Christianity. Christianity plays a contributory role. The trick of the last century is that Christianity has, or at least portions of Christianity, have played an increasingly detrimental role with the rise of modern fundamentalism at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century. To be clear, fundamentalists have never been the majority of Christians in the world. And the way fundamentalists think has never been the dominant way that the church expresses itself in the world. It has, though, been both a very easily identifiable on the part of the wider society way of understanding Christians in the world, and really since the late 70s, early 80s, a disproportionately politically powerful way of understanding Christianity in the world. And at least within that fundamentalism, you get all kinds of problems that are developed because fundamentalism starts with a deep suspicion of the way the sciences are going, especially with regard to, say, Darwinian thought on the natural evolution of species.
Yeah. That's Mark. All of that is such powerful brain candy for me. I would love to go back over the last 5 minutes and unpack that, but I would have to do it in another visit with you, because it is time now for us to turn to what is the immediate problem and the immediacy of the problem and how it relates to COVID-19. How is COVID-19 related to our creation crisis? And the all important question, what are we going to do? How are we going to change everything? And how are we going to transcend our polarized minds to get together and do something?
Mm-hmm. Wow, that is an overwhelming set of questions you're throwing out there. Let me try and just scratch the surface toward addressing some of them. Let's start with COVID-19. The SARS-CoV-2 virus begins most probably, we're still exploring this, through a particular set of interactions, human interactions with the non-human natural world of creation, especially with bats. At least that seems to be what we're discovering along the way. It's important to know that bats and human beings have lived together for millennia, and that in fact bats have provided incredibly important goods for the world and for human beings, right? Their guano is a rich source of nutrients for farmers. They are reducers of insects that carry other types of diseases. But part of what we're seeing with bats in China and elsewhere is the rapid expansion of diseases in bat populations. That is, we are getting increasingly diseased bats. It is these diseased bats that quite likely, quite possibly, would be the source of the SARS-CoV-2 virus that has led to the COVID-19 illnesses. Those diseases, the rate at which they are arising are likely related, and you can't be too specific on causation here because causes are just so complex when you get into these worlds, are likely related to human-shaped factors along the way in their natural environment, like their ability to be protected from certain goods, their exposure to other parts of creation they didn't used to be exposed to as we move things from place to place. So it is the human interaction with sickness in bats that shapes our sickness, most probably. I don't want to be definitive here, all the research is still underway. And we're not equipped to deal with that, with this virus. This is not something we've seen before. That's why it's a novel coronavirus, a new coronavirus. So we're forcing species, including ourselves, to evolve at a rate that we simply can't because of the impact of human beings in the world. But we have a singular advantage, so far as we can say, with levels of sophisticated and abstract thought and communicative skills and technologies available to actually help us address this pandemic. And there are, I think, good signs that we will have some type of vaccine in place within, we'll call it a year. I think that is a hopeful but not unrealistic assessment. Even once we have addressed this, we're still looking at the foundational problems that led to the pandemic as not being resolved. And quite frankly, as not being really easily resolved at all. And those are related to larger changes, the reality of climate change, the catastrophic loss of biodiversity, the explosive growth of pollutants in the world. I mean, the things we're dealing with now are comparatively tame compared to the things we are dealing with and will be dealing with more extensively over the next 100 years. The upshot of that is overwhelming. It's overwhelming because the size of the issues is global, because the ability of one person or a small group of people to address them is non-existent. The policy changes necessary to address them meaningfully are not only enormous, but the world is not well situated to shape those policy changes. We are modern society shaped by modern notions of nation states with borders and sovereignty within them, none of which the natural world respects.
Right.
The upshot of this is, I think if I were not a Christian and I felt that it was my responsibility to solve the world right now, or to work with others to solve the world right now, I would surrender. Because the enormity of the problems is just simply too big. And the human capacity to address them is beyond our reach.
Okay. Let me stop you there. May I pause you?
Sure, but that means I got to save the good news for a couple minutes from now.
I understand.
Yeah.
I just want, I'm feeling the potential impact of what you've just said on the people who are viewing this. And I feel your theology of hope coming. Mm-hmm. Really feel you're moving us there. When you said, if I were not a Christian, I wouldn't, I would think. However, before we get there, I want to tell everybody who's listening in, we're going to get to the hope. I promise you all, we're going to get to the hope. We're not going to end this without the hope. And the hopeful list of things we can do, both personally, politically, and culturally. Before we go there, I just need to mark what Mark has said. And that is that COVID-19 is neither some kind of mysterious invasion on us that we don't have any understanding of why, nor is it God's punishment on a horrible society. Neither of those stories is going to work for us. Mm-hmm. There is another story, and it is the story of interwoven creation, and that displacement of species. I mean, lots of other complicated things, but let's just talk about the displacement of species has impacted, in terms of a domino effect, our being experiencing this virus, which is a species of creation, a living species in which Christ exists, and we're all interwoven in Christ's love and creation, that we, in our choices, have impacted and set up the historic moment we're in. Is that too simple to have said, Mark?
Well, yeah, but everything that we can possibly say is going to turn out to be too simple for the complexity of it. But the key insight there is to recognize um, the intrinsic interrelatedness of creation. It is simply not the case that we can imagine ourselves apart from the rest of God's creation. That we have tried to do so is revealing our own failings along the way. Now, I recognize that we aren't necessarily like a lot of the rest of creation. We do have types of skills and abilities that make us distinct and have helped shape what some scholars are calling the arrival of the Anthropocene, a geological age in which human beings, specifically Homo sapiens, have the capacity to affect the Earth on a geological scale, right? We're the first species in a very, very, very long time that has done this. So I'm not trying to kind of just make us one more creature among creation that is not different. There are differences, there is diversity, and we need to recognize that. We have powers that other creatures simply do not have. I am trying to say that we can't separate ourselves out and that we need to stop thinking of ourselves in that way.
So let's just underscore that. That is one of the realities of creation, and actually one of the beauties of creation. This is a gift. Mm-hmm. We are created in an interdependent way. Mm-hmm. And it's the beauty and loving grace of God's creation. Mm-hmm. I just want to love that. I want to embrace it, breathe it deeply. That is not just theology, if you can just say theology. It's life, it's reality. Like Dr. Martin Luther King said, this is the way the cosmos is constructed. Mm-hmm. So I want to just reinforce one other thing before we go to the solution part of our conversation. And that is that unless we make some fundamental changes in the way the human race interacts, and you raised a huge one in terms of just the way we think in terms of the sovereignty of different nations, which creation actually, now this will be crude, Mark, but creation couldn't give a damn about our sovereign national boundaries and all of that. We have got to this is calling us, I think, to a new vision of planetary life. Is that too reductionistic for me to say that?
No, not at all. Especially because I think what you're saying is nothing like a kumbaya moment. We just all human beings need to get together. It's that the modern notion of the nation state, in which sovereignty exists within state or for states and individuals, increasingly is a non-viable starter for making sense of the biggest issues that we face, and in fact has been a contributing factor in the problems that we now have to address. That's where my own research and writing these days is, which is exploring the way climate change is reshaping conflict, war in the 21st century, and the origins of the problems and how we might go forward. So, right. So to say that this is a human-wide and creation-wide thing is not to say if we just hold hands and hum together meaningfully, we'll be okay. That's not the world we live in.
Yeah. So one more parenthetical statement before I let you go, and I know you're revving to go to the hope. I can feel it in you, my brother. Mm-hmm. So I have this little Wednesday night class in which now on Zoom, about 70 of us study theologians who are trying to state a new Christian narrative. Mm-hmm. And it just makes my heart beat fast. It is so thrilling. And what I learned not only from the resources that we're studying, but also from all of us who are students, a community of students, it's just very inspiring. This past Wednesday, somebody raised their impatience with the cliche we're all in this thing together.
Mhm.
Well, we said, say more, say more, say more. And this is my language now, not that person's. We can be in this thing together and come out on the other side just as blind, somnolent, divided, and polarized as we were when we went in it. Something else has got to go on. And as we massaged this moment in the class, I was thinking about Michelangelo at age 87 saying, I'm still learning.
Mhm.
And something that I've been taught, that if you tell your story as a hero or as a victim, neither of those stories is really going to be as rich as if you tell your own story as a learner.
Mhm.
So I was arguing for, yes, we're in this thing together, and we need to be learners in this thing together. And you have just turned on a huge light bulb for me in terms of one of the things we've got to learn in terms of planetary cooperation, reconciliation, avoidance of war, on and on and on.
Yeah, I'll tell you, just parenthetically, I have a small bronze plaque of Michelangelo's quote in my office next to the door, that is a reminder when I come in and when I step out of that particular place, that is what I fundamentally am.
Yeah.
So I'm an
Yeah.
encounterer of the world, and that is shaping how I learn. So yeah.
Good. Well, I've got to do the publicity video for tomorrow and the sermon tomorrow and this conversation tomorrow, and I think I'll flash up that plaque. Yeah, I got one in Ireland myself.
Yeah.
So thank you very much for that. Now, we must move on because our time is limited. How are we going to change? What do we need to change? What do we need to do?
Mm-hmm.
We're in a crisis. And as we know, as Christians, I think that crises are times of great learning and suffering and new life. That's the story of the cross.
Right.
So go for it, brother.
Right. So let me start with this. There are romantic notions out there of if we just band together, we can solve the world and solve the problems. I would say that particular narrative is just another manifestation of the dominion narrative. Like, we're just in charge. If you just put us in charge, we'll get it fixed. And because it's another manifestation of that narrative, it is as likely to be pain and suffering causing as the current narrative, the dominionist narrative, is. Moreover, I don't think that is the true Christian narrative, right? The Christian narrative is that God has always refused to leave us bereft of God's presence. And whether that was in sending prophets or sending his own son, or he and his son sending the Spirit, God continues to be at work in the world. For Christians, most clearly in crucifixion and resurrection, but clearly at work in the world. And so part of what we need to imagine is that it is not our responsibility to solve the world and make history come out right. That's never been our job. Instead, our job is to look out and see what God is doing, and then work to get on board with it. And toward that end, I think attention to the Christian narrative that involves care for those who are less well off, and care for creation is fundamental. Care for creation is fundamental because our narrative begins in creation there. We were put in the garden to till and keep it, to participate in its living, and it consummates at the end of this narrative, consummates in a holy city coming into place, but not one that is replacing nature, but one in which the natural world and the city interact, become one with each other, and all is transformed. between now and then, between creation and new creation, the completion of creation, our job is to figure out what God is doing and get on board by figuring out what God is commanding and enabling us to do. And toward that, in that regard, first, I think we have to pay attention to how we are impacting the natural world. But second, to recognize that the way we are impacting the natural world is not being experienced equivalently by human beings. That the color of your skin and the amount of money that you have makes you far more vulnerable or less vulnerable to the impact of things like this pandemic, of things like rising sea levels, of things like the lack of safe water. All of these things are in place. So what Christians, I think, are being called to do right now isn't to make history come out right, but to do the things that God is commanding and enabling us to do and has been doing so for a long time. So some simple practices that I think are important for us. The first is plant trees. Plant trees because trees are the best way we have come up with that we can do anything about toward reducing the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. Trees are machines for converting CO2 into oxygen, making life better for us. Moreover, conceptually, trees are just great, what's the word I'm looking for? Images, ideas. The tree that you plant now isn't successful for 40 years. Trees are signs of hope. When you plant a tree, you're not saying, I don't need to solve things now. I want this tree to exist for my great-grandchildren. So plant some trees is just a simple and really good thing to do in all ways. I think the second thing we need to do is be alert to our need to understand ourselves as not separate from the rest of creation at very fundamental levels. Short tangent, the cells that you think of as your body, the majority of them do not share your DNA. Your body itself is a teeming wilderness of creatures that benefit from your existence and that you benefit from their existence. You wouldn't exist were it not for bacteria that are different than you that live in your gut and make it possible for you to digest food. Most of us is not us the way we think it is. We are our own wildernesses. We need to stop thinking of ourselves as separate from it. So pay attention to our own health means paying attention to the health of those around us. And that, I think, is a good thing. Pay attention to those who are most impacted and least able to defend themselves as a result of our intrusions and the suffering of creation that we have caused. And recognize that we do this partly at individual levels to shape practices, to shape habits of care, but we do it at corporate levels as well if we're going to shape the types of policies that are necessary to lead us forward. So in that regard, I think the other thing that if you care about creation, you have to do is 1, vote. 2, make sure other people can vote. And 3, make sure people's votes are counted equitably. We are, in the middle of a campaign season. If you're voting, you ought to be paying attention to who's saying what about the way we are interacting with each other, about what needs to be the case for the way we interact with each other, what way we interact with the non-human natural world. And we need to expand the range of conversation partners whose part of whose conversation is to vote with us. So more informed voters, more voters, more votes counted equitably, I think turns out in the long run to be incredibly important, not only for the stability and health of our politic, but for the stability and health of creation as well.
Powerful, powerful, powerful. I'm a Bapto-Episcopalian. All you have to do now is play Just As I Am, and I'll come down front and give myself to Jesus one more time after that sermon.
Well, Thank you. I'm reformed, so you don't need to give yourself to Jesus because Jesus already gave yourself to us, and that's the important part that matters. So it works out.
Do love you're telling healthy theological stories to displace all of those delusional stories
Yeah.
many of us received. It's really, really wonderful. I I'm looking at the clock, and we must stop
Mhm.
because one of the ways I want to keep my job is not asking people to listen to a 2 or 3 hour conversation between me and somebody that I love. This has really been wonderful. Um, I I'm just going to stop there. But you have now, my friend, promised on video
Mhm.
to send me a reading list that I can share with my brothers and sisters, my siblings in the human family in this faith community. Because we are a learning church and we want to learn. And we want to stay in touch with you. Um,
Absolutely. I would. I'll be delighted to do this more as you all are interested in me having me do it more. Whether it's online like this or face to face, as I've done in the past there, and hope to do so in the future.
Very, very good. Um, let's just say that when uh, we may want to get you back on video, and certainly when we're able to physically gather, we'll want you to come and talk with us again. And just, uh, I do want you to say just a word about your current research and the
Mhm.
book you're working on. It's so fascinating. So can you just give a word about that, and then I'll close.
Sure. So it's actually a 3-book trilogy that I'm working on that links my own research and writing on violence, on war and peace issues, with my concerns about environmental issues. And it is, as I think I noted earlier, looking at the way climate change is impacting war in the 21st century. As I started that research, I wanted to look forward, but what I discovered is the resources were not in place for me theologically to help me make sense of how to look forward. So I needed to re-narrate some Christian histories. So the first book that came out about a year ago is called Christian Pacifism for an Environmental Age, in which I re-narrate the history of the Christian pacifist tradition to make it more functional for life in the Anthropocene, and suggest that the narrative I'm giving is actually um, theologically and historically more accurate anyway about the way the pacifist tradition has functioned. The book I'm working on right now and just wrapping up, I'm just doing revisions before it goes off to the press, is doing a similar thing to the Christian just war tradition, thinking especially about how the Christian just war tradition, as it transitioned from its late medieval to its early modern form, shaped the conditions that made it more difficult for us to address the wars of the 21st century. Once I'm done with that book and both of those books are out and I've kind of already started, then the third volume I'll be able to dive into, which is the constructive move forward. How should the church be thinking about climate shaped conflicts in the 21st century? And there I'll pay particular attention to 3 foci. The first is the changing shape of religion and religious engagement in the 21st century. The second is the way the church does and does not think about resources. And the third is the way the church does and doesn't treat refugees. Those are kind of be the 3 big bits for the third book. I will say, I don't expect anybody to buy the books. They're from Cambridge Press. It's a distinguished academic press. It's also really expensive. The first one's $100. The next one will be $100. I'm sure the third one will be $100. My wife is encouraging me to write a 4th short book that would be for a popular press rather than an academic one that kind of summarizes and makes accessible stuff. Maybe I'll get to that when I finish the third one. So that's the big project. I think probably maybe send you a chapter to give at least some of you a sense of kind of the way the first book plays itself out with re-narrating the history of Christian pacifism that fits some of the stuff we've been talking about today. I think I'll also send you a couple of very short articles, a couple thousand words that I've written for various journals on science and religion for a wider popular press that could be helpful too.
Mark, I would really, really love that. And I do want to just underscore the importance of that project of re-narrating Christianity. We talk an awful lot at St. Luke's about telling a story that's the story of Jesus rather than about Jesus, and how Christianity so easily went off track in following Jesus and the religion of Jesus, that and the way that Jesus had about him. So I'm just so strongly applauding your being somebody who's re-narrating Christianity. I think that's a wonderful way to describe a lot of the people I really want to read and learn from. And then the other thing that I want to emphasize is I want to get into your wife's corner and encourage you to write that fourth volume. Is Mark Douglas's, I'm tempted to say Guide for Dummies, but I know you can't write something that's dummy, but that's really, really accessible, because accessibility is huge.
Mm-hmm.
It's very, very important. I love your trilogy, and I love the fact that you have people asking you to make it as accessible as possible.
Yeah. Well, and the wonder of the current time, as we're seeing right now, is increased accessibility. I mean, you're in one state, I'm in another state, Zach's in a different place than I am, and all of you will be gathered at various places, and yet accessibility will flow from it. So, yeah.
Blessings.
And to you and to the church.
Thank you very much. It's been a great, great ride today.
Well, it's been a pleasure for me as well. Thank you.
Good deal. Thank you, everybody who's been tuning in. We will have more and more wonderful interviews like this. Next week, interestingly enough, we'll be with Rob Wright, the Bishop of the Diocese of Atlanta, talking about what he's learning and how church is changing and how we are in the midst of a new church. And then we have more and more guests. So welcome. And those of you who are visiting with us, who don't usually come into St. Luke's, we are thrilled you're here. You can go to our website, fill out a visitor's card, let us stay in touch with you. We have now an international group of people watching us every Sunday. We're thrilled about that, and we would love to add you to it. Blessings, everyone. Thanks very much, Martin Douglas.
Thank you.
Goodbye.